The Last Stand of Faith, ISIS, the Ethiopian martyrs, and the 21 Egyptian Christians. What would you do if armed men surrounded you? They gave you one choice: give up your faith or die. In 2015, in the chaos of Libya, ISIS turned this terrifying question into reality for groups of Christian migrants. First came the images of 21 Egyptian Christians on a beach. Then, just 2 months later, another ISIS video appeared, this time showing the killing of Ethiopian Christians. But behind those horrifying images were not numbers. They were fathers, sons, brothers, workers who had left home believing they were traveling toward a better future. And according to the videos released by ISIS, they were targeted because of their Christian faith. This is not only the story of how ISIS killed them, it is the story of why ISIS wanted the world to watch, and how the victims became symbols of faith and human dignity. Libya, a country in chaos. To understand what happened, we have to go back to Libya. After the fall of Muammar Gaddafi in 2011, Libya entered years of political instability and armed conflict. By 2014 and 2015, competing governments and armed groups were fighting for control. In this environment, extremist organizations found an opportunity to expand. ISIS established a particularly strong presence in the city of Sirte. Human Rights Watch later documented serious abuses by ISIS-affiliated groups in Libya, including unlawful killings, abductions, and summary executions. In Sirte, ISIS attempted to control not only territory, but people's entire lives. They imposed their extreme interpretation of religious law, restricted freedom, and used public violence to frighten the population to submission. And then they turned their attention toward Christian migrants. The 21 Egyptian Christians. On February 15, 2015, ISIS released a video showing 21 captured Christian men in Libya. Most were Egyptian Coptic Christians. They had traveled to Libya looking for work and a way to support their families. Instead, they were captured. The video presented them as enemies because of their Christian identity. The men were dressed alike and taken to a beach. What followed was an execution carried out for propaganda. Amnesty International described the killing of the 21 Coptic Christians as a war crime and an attack on fundamental principles of humanity. But there was something about the victims that ISIS could not control. Their identity, their dignity, their faith. The men had been placed in an impossible situation. Yet their deaths became a symbol far beyond Libya. Their families were left to face something no family should ever have to experience. And Egypt responded. The Egyptian government announced that it would retaliate against ISIS positions in Libya, and Egyptian forces carried out airstrikes against suspected ISIS targets. But ISIS was not finished. 2 months later, Ethiopian Christians. Only about 2 months later, another horrifying video appeared. On April 19, 2015, ISIS released footage purporting to show the killing of approximately 30 Ethiopian Christians in Libya. The video showed 2 separate groups. One group was taken to a beach. Another was shown in a remote desert-like area. Reports described the first group being killed by beheading and the second by shooting. The exact number and identities of every victim were initially difficult to independently verify. But the Ethiopian government stated that the people shown were Ethiopian citizens. And suddenly, Ethiopia was facing the same nightmare Egypt had faced only weeks earlier. Christian migrants, far from home, captured by ISIS, and killed in front of cameras. Why did ISIS film these killings? This is one of the most important questions. Why would a terrorist organization record its own crimes? Because the camera was part of the weapon. ISIS did not simply want to kill. It wanted to create fear. It wanted families around the world to see what could happen to people who opposed it. And it wanted millions of viewers to feel powerless. Human Rights Watch documented how ISIS used public executions and other abuses in Sirte as part of its system of terror and control. The victims were therefore being used as propaganda targets. But ISIS made a terrible calculation. It believed that showing these people dying would make the world remember ISIS. Instead, the world also remembered the victims, their names, their families, their faith, and their courage. The faith of the victims. There is another part of this story that is often forgotten. The people in those videos were not simply victims. They were human beings with lives before the cameras ever appeared. They had families, they had dreams, they had ordinary struggles. Some had traveled hundreds or thousands of kilometers searching for work. They were trying to build a future. But when ISIS captured them, their lives were reduced to a political and religious message by the terrorists, and yet their Christian identity remained. That is why their story became so powerful among Christians in Egypt and Ethiopia. Their deaths were remembered not simply as acts of terrorism, but as examples of people who were killed without abandoning their faith. For many believers, the central message became, you can take someone's life, but you cannot force their conscience to surrender. That distinction matters, because the power of faith is not measured by violence. It is measured by what a person refuses to become, even when confronted with violence. ISIS and the people of Sirte. The atrocities did not stop with foreign Christians. ISIS also terrorized people living under its control. Human Rights Watch documented executions, forced restrictions, intimidation, and other abuses in Sirte. People accused of spying, blasphemy, sorcery, or opposing ISIS could face brutal punishment. The group attempted to create an environment where fear became part of everyday life. This is important because it shows that the victims of ISIS were not limited to one nationality. Egyptians suffered. Ethiopians suffered. Libyans suffered. And people from many other backgrounds suffered under the group's violence. ISIS claimed to speak in the name of religion, but its actions brought suffering to Muslims, Christians, and others alike. What remains after the horror? The camera stopped. The propaganda disappeared from the headlines, but the families remained. Mothers still had sons who would never return. Children grew up without fathers. Brothers lost brothers. And two countries carried the memory of their citizens. Egypt remembered the 21 Coptic Christians. Ethiopia remembered its citizens killed in Libya. The victims could not return home. But their stories could. And perhaps that is why ISIS failed in one of its most important objectives. ISIS wanted the world to remember its power. Instead, the world remembered the people it murdered. The final message. The story of these men is not really about how they died. It is about who they were before they died. They were workers. They were fathers. They were sons. They were brothers. They were believers. And they became victims of one of the most brutal extremist organizations of the modern era. Their story also carries a warning. Terrorism does not begin with the execution. It begins when human beings are turned into enemies simply because of who they are. It begins when hatred becomes more powerful than humanity, and it ends only when people refuse to let fear define them. The men on those beaches could not choose their fate, but the world can choose how it remembers them. Not as helpless numbers, not as images from a terrorist video, but as human beings who had names, families, dreams, and faith. And perhaps that is the final thing ISIS could never take away: their identity, their dignity, and the memory they left behind.